Heading down the home stretch, this is the renaissance of psychedelics, and I'd like to introduce the moderator for today's panel, Dr. John Crystal. Dr. Crystal is the McNeil Professor and Chair of Psychiatry at Yale and Yale New Haven Hospital. His research focuses on the neurobiology and treatment of psychiatric disorders. His laboratory conducted the controlled trial that identified the rapid antidepressant effects of ketamine, and this discovery led to the first mechanistically novel antidepressant approved by the FDA in over 50 years, which is esketamine, also known as Spravato. He directs or co-directs the following: the Yale Center for Clinical Investigation, the Center for Translational Neuroscience of Alcohol, and the Neuroscience Division of the National Center for PTSD. He is a member of the National Academy of Medicine, a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the co-director of the Neuroscience Forum of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and editor of Biological Psychiatry. With our co-panelist, Dina Burkitt-Baeva, he co-founded Freedom Biosciences, a company aimed at developing next-generation, rapid-acting antidepressants and non-hallucinatory psychedelics. Dr. Crystal.
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here with you today, and for me, it's wonderful to be with this panel, each of whom is a good friend of mine, and it's a pleasure to be talking about this extremely important and timely topic, which are how psychedelic drugs and entactogens, drugs like MDMA, and you'll hear methadone, may transform the treatment of psychiatric disorders if they can be implemented. And so before I go into too much detail, I'd like to introduce the panel so you get a sense of the incredible people, and I'm just going to go down the order here. So sitting next to me is Mike Apcon, who's a part of Integrated Investment Partners, which are a company investing in the development of novel treatments for brain health and behavioral health. Briefly, his background: he received his MD, PhD from WashU, did his residency in pediatrics at Yale, ran the neonatal ICU. I remember you not getting much sleep in those days. Got an MBA from Yale, became vice president of Yale New Haven Children's Hospital, then CMO at the Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania, CHOP, CEO of Hospital for Sick Children, sometimes called Sick Kids in Toronto, and then CEO of Tufts Medical Center, and became president of Sand Street Advisors. He's been an advisor to a number of psychedelic companies and sees both sides of the implementation, both the hospital side and the development side. Next to him is my co-founder, Dina Burkitt-Baeva. Dina graduated from the University of Oxford and then Harvard Business School. She's been a serial investor, co-founder of SciMed Ventures, and most recently, my tremendous pleasure to be co-founder of Freedom Biosciences, a company that is contributing in this space. Next to Dina is Chris Pittenger, the Elizabeth Mears and House Jameson Professor of Psychiatry, Deputy Chair of the Department of Psychiatry at Yale for Translational Research, MD, PhD from the laboratory of Nobel laureate Eric Kandel at Columbia. He has contributed to many areas in translational neuroscience with an emphasis on striatal-related plasticity and its relevance to disorders of compulsive behavior like obsessive-compulsive disorder. He's also head of the Yale program in psychedelic science, which is an entity which brings people together across the spectrum of research from very basic neuroscience, genomics, et cetera, cell models, all the way up through issues of policy and ethics. Next to Chris is my old friend Kurt Rasmussen, and I meant that in a good way. Kurt received his PhD with Barry Jacobs at the University of Princeton University. Then he came to Yale to postdoc with George Agajanian, one of the true pioneers of psychedelic research. After launching his career, he moved to Lilly Neuroscience, where he was for 25 years a leader of their many neuroscience programs and initiatives there. He then left Lilly to be head of treatment development at the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and most recently moved to Delix Therapeutics, which is developing non-hallucinogenic tryptamine neuroplastogens. That's the current term. It's wonderful to have you here, Kurt. And then Kevin Ryan. Kevin is probably very well known to all of you. He's an investor, serial entrepreneur, co-founder and chairman of Transcend Therapeutics, which was co-founded with Ben Calmendi, a faculty member in the Department of Psychiatry, a Yale graduate, a founder and CEO of Alicorp, and many companies. One of the things that's just extraordinary is the range of his entrepreneurship and the impact that these companies have had. Transcend is developing Transcend 201, which is an alternative, you might say, to MDMA, a compound called methylone, for PTSD and other disorders. This is an extremely timely time to have this discussion. On Tuesday, the FDA is going to review MDMA for the treatment of PTSD, something that is long anticipated, and become, more intriguing how that discussion will go with as a consequence of the report from an agency called ICER that has raised some questions about it. So let's begin at the beginning here, and I'm going to throw the first question to Mike. What do you see as the opportunities and challenges as we're going to be faced as we try to deliver psilocybin and MDMA as treatments?
Thanks, John. Thanks for the invitation to participate in this. I think I'm Mike.
You're okay.
What I find really exciting and interesting about this class of medications is, first, it addresses a very significant unmet need. And I think it's hard to overestimate the burden of mental illness from the standpoint of cost, lost productivity, lost lives. And we really haven't had much in the way of changing therapy in decades, with the exception until ketamine's approval. And these compounds seem to work through a totally different mechanism of action. But what I find really interesting about them is that they don't really plug into a traditional psychopharmacology model of prescribing a medication that people take daily or, periodically. And so in addition to the typical challenges of drug development, improving efficacy, there's really a need to develop a whole ecosystem around these compounds that addresses the training of professionals, both people that are licensed to prescribe and also the people that will help guide patients, people that are being treated through the experience of the treatment itself. The cost of the medications and the tying in with the interventional psychology and psychiatry also requires the evolution of new payment mechanisms. The delivery model often goes over many hours, which makes it hard to fit in a typical office setting and may actually require different monitoring depending on what substances. So, I think what we're going to see and what we are seeing already to a certain extent with ketamine is the evolution of a number of elements of that ecosystem, everything from training programs, payment reform, delivery models, and also adjuncts to therapy that might rely on digital tools or other things to help people through the preparation, the experience itself, and then the follow-up activity. And I think that evolution of that ecosystem is as challenging as the drug development itself, I think, although we're getting a lot of insight through the experience with ketamine now.
Thank you. And so how do you think that people will actually deliver the psychotherapy part as they're trained to do if the drugs are approved?
Well, so I think one of the concerns that I have, and I think that has been reflected in some of the language coming out of the FDA as they look at MDMA and psilocybin, is how important the integrity of the psychotherapeutic component is to the therapeutic effect, and whether it will be possible to regulate that in a way that creates sufficient comfort around the safety and the cost benefit relationship. So, the trials so far have been done with very tight control over the training program that the therapists have undergone, what the preparation looks like, how the studies are completed. In fact, the ICER paper raises some questions about that, which will be interesting to explore. But it's not known how important that is to the ultimate outcome. And so, I think once, my experience with other therapies is once they're in the wild, so to speak, it's very difficult to rigorously control the way they're prescribed and delivered. And I think that is a concern with these compounds.
Do you think we're gonna have problems with ways in which these drugs are implemented in the real world then?
I think it'd be naive to expect that we won't have some problems. I think the question is how we respond to that and how we put the guardrails around that and how we weigh the cost benefit. And many of these compounds are widely used around the world now therapeutically. So off label or off, without approval. You can go to the Caribbean and be treated with some of these compounds. You can go to Mexico for ibogaine treatment for substance use disorder. You can go on journeys in Central South America if you want to. And we know enough from some of that experience that there can be problems. There can be problems with people not using them appropriately, with patients not being selected appropriately. Those problems exist with almost anything else we approve as well. So it's not unique to these substances, but does need to be considered as the FDA puts together their risk mitigation strategy and as people are trained to use these and as payers make decisions about how they will choose who to cover for this kind of therapy.
Well, I think this is a good point to transition to my next question, which is directed to Chris Pittenger. So, Chris, you're a neuroscientist and a translational psychiatrist. So how do these drugs work, and how are they related to the biology of the disorders where they're being used to treat patients? In other words, how does the biology of depression or the biology of PTSD relate to what psychedelics and MDMA do? And are these specific treatments, or are these kind of more general treatments for a variety of other conditions? So there are other disorders that we should keep our eye out for?
So it feels like a question I can answer in either 20 seconds or 2 hours. The 22nd is we don't know. Like so many drugs, like almost all the treatments that we have in psychiatry, we as a society and as a medical establishment stumbled upon the efficacy of these drugs. They, occurred naturally in the case of psilocybin, or were synthesized in the case of MDMA. People used them. They had, in fact, and lo and behold, we discovered that there was the potential for a treatment, but it wasn't developed out of an understanding of how they actually work. Now, that said, here comes the 2-hour answer. There's a whole academic and non-academic industry around trying to figure out how these work, both because it's fascinating, but also because if we can figure out how it works, then we can optimize them. We can mitigate side effects. We can focus the effects. And there's a range of theories, which, and I won't do 2 hours, I promise, but broadly, there's sort of molecular theories, which is that these act on neurons in the brain and they do stuff. And the most common theme there is that they enhance neural plasticity. They allow neurons to more robustly connect together and produce new networks. And that overlaps with things that we already know that classical antidepressants like fluoxetine or Prozac do, as well as what we already know the ketamine does. So that fits nicely. So it may be that they're doing the same thing that these older drugs do. They're just doing it in a maybe better way, maybe more lasting way that differs in some way, but on the same stage. So these molecular theories. It's actually really important whether those theories are sufficient to explain it, because if they are, then this idea of producing psychedelics that don't have psychedelic effects is possible and potentially a really important thing to do. If those molecular explanations aren't sufficient, then that might not be possible. And that's just a question the field's going to figure out. There are these brain network theories about how psychedelics work, that the brain is made up of these different networks that interact together, and maybe they're resetting those networks in some way. Maybe psychologically they're breaking people out of cognitive rigidity in some way at the brain network level. So that'd be the second category. And the third category types into more psychological constructs. Maybe they're enhancing our experience of meaning, which so many of our psychiatric disorders can be characterized as an alienation from meaning. Maybe so much of our society can be characterized as an alienation from meaning. So maybe they're tapping into that kind of thing. I mean, my guess is that all of these levels of analysis have some truth, and they're not mutually exclusive. They're just different ways of looking at the same thing. But anyway, again, the short answer is we don't know, but it's an exciting area to try to understand. And as I said early on, some of those answers have real implications for where the field goes next, for what we should be focusing on, what elements it makes sense to try to isolate versus not, how important the therapy is. The answers to these questions are intimately integrated with that.
Do you want to talk about the breadth of disorders?
Sure.
Depression, PTSD, others?
Yeah, it's really interesting that it's early days yet for most disorders. The data are best for depression and psilocybin and for PTSD with MDMA. So that's where we really have a fair bit of confidence that these drugs have good therapeutic effect. But if you look at the earlier studies, it's incredible how many studies there appears to be benefit from. So with psilocybin, there's good evidence for benefit for depression, but also for alcoholism, nicotine, opiate, cocaine addiction. We've just completed the first controlled study in OCD, and the data look pretty good. There's interest and very early data in looking at chronic pain. There's interest in looking at Parkinson's disease. So
cluster
headache. Thank you.
Traumatic brain injuries. The range is very, very wide.
So if, in fact, the only small, well-done early study that I know that didn't show an effect was the study at Hopkins of anorexia nervosa. Honestly, I was kind of relieved to see that it didn't work in something, because that gives me a little bit more confidence. But it may be that they underdosed it. Maybe it will work. Maybe they didn't hit it right. When you think about it, in one sense, I mean, that lack of specificity is actually, we're embarrassed to admit, not very odd in psychiatry. I mean, we use Prozac. I joke with my residents. Prozac works 50% of the time in 50% of our diagnoses, right? So this kind of non-specificity isn't that odd. But so maybe it's just the same thing. Maybe it's telling us that our diagnoses we're not carving nature at the appropriate joints, and we need to think of a fundamentally different way to categorize and conceptualize the modes of mental suffering that we as psychiatrists are trying to treat. And often in the history of psychiatry, accidents of pharmacology have led to new ways to dissociate disorders, and we may be in the midst of such a thing now. But maybe, and then I think in threes. So maybe maybe it's because they're tapping into something that truly is transdiagnostic. So maybe it's plasticity. That could be affected in lots of disorders. Maybe it's something about brain networks like the default mode network, which is implicated in lots of disorders. Maybe it's something like reconnecting us with a felt sense of meaning and combating alienation, which is, or enhancing cognitive flexibility. These are things that aren't specific to any one disorder. And if you had a medication that was targeting one of these central transdiagnostic phenomena, then you would expect it to work across lots of conditions. Time will tell.
Thank you, Chris. So, Kevin, your company is developing an alternative to MDMA. And it would be really interesting to know what made you want to go down that road. In other words, why wasn't MDMA good enough in a way? And what do you think methadone or other alternatives to MDMA might bring to the table that would be helpful?
Yeah, and I think the context really is that there are 300 or so psychedelics, and so many different variations. The reason you've heard about 5 or 6 of them are not because studies showed that for mental health those were the best things. They're literally because those were the most enjoyable for people to take recreationally, and so you've heard about them. And then someone at some point said, "Wait, your depression has gone away. Maybe we should really test for that." And we sort of backed into this. There's no, it would be amazing if we had tested all 300 of them for all 20 conditions and then found out what works for what. And so the thought process was that we went through is, look, the odds are those other 295 might be less enjoyable to take, but have some condition that makes them interesting. So methadone is a little bit less toxic. It's a little bit less empathetic, which is why people don't take it as much, but it may have a lot of the benefits and be a little bit softer. You may not have to come down the next day. And so it may be something that could be taken with SSRIs as well. And that would be huge. One of the things that no one focuses on in psychedelics is for a number of the substances, if you are taking a SSRI, you can't participate in a trial and can't be given it. Well, if you're trying to address people who have mental health issues, a lot of them are already taking something. They don't want to get off it. We're not going to solve the problem until we can tackle that. So that's one of the reasons we wanted to go after it. And there had been some academic work done, little work done before that showed extraordinarily good results. The results we have so far are very good and are equal to or better than MDMA. Still early. We're going into phase 2 trials right now, but it's pretty encouraging here. Before we get off this, I want to just leverage off one point that Mike had said. I think it's important to set the stage at psychedelics that, if this were a trial and you're trying to get unbiased jurors, there are no unbiased jurors on this subject. That all of us, went through a system in society that just convinced us that these are dangerous things that you should stay away from, which is why probably the majority of people here in the last 10 years have not tried anything. But the majority of people here have had a glass of alcohol. And I always remind people, for example, if I told you we're going to introduce a psychedelic on the Yale campus, and there's a lot of benefits, some problems, but you should know that there'll be between 100 and 200 cases of sexual assault per year, which is the case in all Ivy League schools right now, just to lock in that number. And all of them will be because people are taking this psychedelic. You would look at me and go, Kevin, we're not going to do that. There's no way we're going to have 150 cases of sexual assault with people on this drug that, wouldn't have happened without it. Right? That'd be unthinkable. And what I'm really talking about is alcohol. And the case in the Ivy League right now is that there are about that number of cases. Every single one, 99% are people on alcohol. 0%, as we've investigated them, are people on psychedelic, even though tons of people on this campus are using them. 0% are people smoking pot. And yet, no one's the slightest bit concerned about that. Everyone's like, well, whatever. It's like 25,000 people die in car crashes or something from alcohol. And you're like, probably shouldn't have done that. So there's just this double standard that is hard to overcome. And the psychedelic industry is overcoming that slowly through data, through academic studies. But we need to get to the point to realize that, mushrooms and LSD are not addictive, you can't overdose, really. And yet alcohol you can. And so once we get over this and get over, one of the things that's a huge problem right now is in the trials, there can be a case of sexual assault. So a patient could be on MDMA and the person in charge of that could take advantage of that patient a little bit. By the way, I'm sure everyone here knows that psychiatrists have slept with their patients, for decades and decades and decades. The rest of society doesn't worry about that much, but we're hypersensitive to this. We're now insisting sometimes that there are 2 people in the room. We're doubling the cost. I mean, it's the equivalent if there was brain surgery and I said, be safer. There's a second brain surgeon in just watching over everything, which probably would make life a tiny bit safer, but not worth the cost. And so we just have this double standard that reverberates through everything, and we have to overcome that.
Yeah. I just want to come back to the point that you started with, because it really needs a lot of thought, which is the vast majority of people who are currently diagnosed as having post-traumatic stress disorder are treated with an SSRI, even if it isn't helping them.
Yeah.
And so what we do know about SSRIs is that even if it's not helping you, if you discontinue the SSRI too quickly, you can get a withdrawal symptom that will make you worse. Mm-hmm. So how is it planned for MDMA, and how do you think about it for methadone? For the vast majority of people with PTSD, how do they get off the SSRI, and how do they become eligible for MDMA treatment?
Our hope for methadone is that they will be able to take it at the same time. So far, it's cleaner and easier to just separate it and say you can't be on it. But then we'll see what people do off-label with doctors. I mean, I don't know that they're prohibited from doing that. Go ahead.
There's a company that the investment fund I work with had invested in called Outro that's really built around helping people get off SSRIs because it's not so easy for many people that try to get off them find that they really can't ever, they're intended to be prescribed for a 6-month period, a year period. The the patients that were coming to outro had been on an average of 15 years or something like that. So they've been on for a long time, had multiple attempts to try to come off. And it requires a tapering approach that's evidence-based that creates a very slow taper that's very different than the way most primary care doctors that prescribe these medications would typically titrate somebody off. So it can be a big challenge. And I think it's one of the reasons why there's a great interest in compounds that you can safely take while on the SSRIs. So it's not practical to wean off over 9 months while you're waiting for therapy.
That's really an important development. So Kurt, so you have MDMA and you have psychedelic drugs, and Delix is trying to come up with next generation versions of these drugs. Could you say a little bit about the way your company is approaching this challenge?
Sure. We are, first of all, it's a very exciting time. More treatment options for more patients is going to be wonderful. We think the psychedelics and MDMA, however you want to define it, will help a lot of people, and that's wonderful. But if we only concentrate on the psychedelics, we're going to leave some people behind. So, for example, anybody with a family or personal history of psychosis is excluded from all the trials that are going on with psilocybin. You'll exacerbate their symptoms. You could create it's trouble. And think about dementia. Giving the psilocybin to Alzheimer's patient, probably not the best idea in the world. But what we think is key is what Chris mentioned earlier, is this change in rapid and enduring change in structural neuroplasticity of very specific neurons. Ketamine has been shown to do this. Ron Duman and George Agajanian showed this a while ago. It's been shown that the psychedelics have the same rapid and enduring change in structural neuroplasticity, which leads to functional changes in neuroplasticity. And it's almost a different way of thinking about things. And if you don't, we think we can separate the hallucinations from that efficacy change in neuroplasticity. We've taken the compounds, the original compounds, and tweaked them chemically, intelligently, to remove what we think is the hallucinations. And in animals, it looks like, no evidence of hallucinogenic-like behavior, as best you can tell that in animals, but maintain the efficacy. And we can argue all day long about whether or not the hallucinations are necessary or not. For some indications, maybe there's an effect. I mean, certain patients firmly believe that. I'm not telling them that they're wrong. But it's going to vary by indication, likely. I don't know how much, insight and oceanic boundlessness you need to have fewer migraines. Probably not that many. But so we've taken our first compound. It's an empirical question. We can argue all day long. It doesn't matter. It's an empirical question. And our first compound is now in people that in the animals, like I said, it's a derivative. It's an isotryptamine, a derivative of a psilocybin or 5-MeO-DMT sort of structure. And it's not causing any hallucinations, zero, no disassociations. We have every scale possible measured, and it's not causing anything. And we're getting evidence of central activity of the compound that it's getting to the brain. Now, the next question is, okay, does it keep the efficacy? And we'll be testing that next. And if that's the case, that will be very exciting, because there's a lot, many patients who can't or won't take these drugs. People, like I said, psychosis, or even patients who will say, I don't care what you say, doc, I ain't taking that. There's people who just won't take it. So anyway, I think we'll have, based on the structural neuroplasticity, it's more of a repair of damaged neurons. It's not just randomly growing synaptic connections in different areas of the brain. It seems like we're speaking a different language now. It's actually addressing a pathophysiology in psychiatric disorders. That's not really been said before. It's every other area of medicine looks at the pathophysiology and repair the pathophysiology. So it looks like we may be able to do it with these compounds that go in and repair damaged synaptic contacts. And that underlying pathology in different brain areas plays a role in many disorders. Depression, clearly, stress can cause a big retraction of cortical neurons. In schizophrenia, the loss of synaptic connections is hugely important, especially in the prefrontal cortex. Even in Alzheimer's, loss of synaptic connections is the leading and best indicator of loss of cognitive function. So we're developing a different kind of compound, but we're rooting for everybody. I see a day when we'll have compounds that are floridly hallucinogenic, LSD or psilocybin, and they'll have a place in the armamentarium of treating disorders. Then hopefully we'll have compounds, hopefully like one of ours, that produce no hallucinations, and there'll be everything in between: mild hallucinations, short hallucinations. And that will be great, because then we can it'll take years of clinical investigation, but then we can sit down and say, okay, what patient, what indication is best served by a hallucinogenic, a non-hallucinogenic, an intermediate one. So that's what we see. And our company is working on trying to develop a non-hallucinogenic neuroplastogen, we call it. And that can have applications in multiple disorders. We're trying depression first, but we hopefully can go on from there.
Yeah, I could see a moment, 20 years from now where you come in, do a brain scan, we understand what's wrong with your brain at that point, and then maybe say, the next level would be, we're going to give you a little bit of compound 3, a big dose of compound 9, and a little bit of 15. Some may be psychedelic, some may not be, because we know what we're solving here. Right now, the truth is, and everyone here knows more about the science than I do, but I'm not sure we even know what causes depression. And so if you start with that, and it's not a new problem, we really know very, very, very little. So once we understand how the brain works, solving it will be much easier. It'll be like, all we get to the point where it's almost like code. Someone who's very good can look at your code and say, the problem is in line 7. It's not debatable. There is a problem right there. Change that and the code works. And that's a fantasy, but we'll probably get closer to that over time.
Well, but I think that strategy, the idea of matching the underlying biology to treatment, something we would refer generally as precision medicine, is really where we see psychiatry going, and linking the biology of the illness to the biology of the treatment is something that is a long-term dream
but
for all of us. Yeah. So Kurt, I couldn't tell from the way you described it whether this is a trial and error process for Delix. In other words, you have multiple molecules and then you test it out and you see whether it produces these behavioral effects, or there are certain neurobiology you're trying to achieve that enables you to predict whether the resulting effect on the circuit is
great question, and that's what I think about every day. So currently, we started out with some basic compounds that affect neuroplasticity, and we're looking at multiple indications. But as we investigate them further, we're seeing different patterns of neuroplasticity changes emerging. Mm-hmm. Just hints right now, but I think that will be key, because there's different ways to light the neuroplasticity fuse. Clearly, ketamine is an NMDA antagonist, psilocybin is a 2A agonist, but they both activate this final common pathway. And I think there are other receptors that can do the same, and we'll discover them. And likely, activation of those different receptors may have different patterns of whole brain neuroplasticity. And when we get to that point, and that's where we're driving, because we're seeing that begin to emerge. Then we're going to take a compound that produces a particular pattern of neuroplasticity and send it towards a particular disorder, because that's where the pathophysiology of the brain for that disorder is. That's the hope.
Yeah, great. So Dina, freedom. Do you want to say a little bit about the approach that Freedom Biosciences is taking to non-hallucinatory psychedelics?
Absolutely. Maybe before I get into that, I just wanted to add to what Kurt was saying, why at Freedom as well as Delix, we're so excited about the potential of non-hallucinogenic psychedelics. And this sort of ties in what Kevin and Michael said of some of the challenges that psychedelics right now have, right? The first one is it's a very burdensome treatment, 6 to 8 hours potentially for psilocybin and MDMA, and also needing to have 2 trained practitioners in the room. And I think if you think through even MDMA getting approved for PTSD, we're going to very shortly run out of therapists unless we really ramp this up. So non-hallucinogenic psychedelics hold a promise of potentially, addressing some of these challenges for a certain patient population. I think definitely there is space for the hallucinogenic and, everything in between. So to get to sort of how does Freedom's approach differ from Delix and some of the other groups that are working on non-hallucinogenic tryptamines, we at Freedom, it builds on top of our platform, which is combination therapy. So basically, Freedom combines a rapid-acting antidepressant such as ketamine or a tryptamine with another drug, we call it a pharmacological enhancer, to basically create a better safety efficacy profile drug. Right, so this is something that we've done with ketamine. This is a drug that has its roots here from Yale that is now going into a phase 2A trial. So we are taking a similar approach with tryptamines now, where we take a tryptamine and we combine it with another drug. I'm not at liberty to say what that is, but there are multiple combinations that are undergoing animal trials here at Yale as well. And this is a different approach than the new compound entities, which is what Delix and some of the other teams are doing. So how is this different besides being a combination, right? So we work with drugs that have been in hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, and definitely in a few hundred patients, right? So because we understand pretty well the safety profile of these drugs, this overall kind of de-risks the safety of the combination. The other thing is that it gives us a great deal of flexibility to change, the drugs that go into the combination as well as doses and the PK to hopefully find the most sort of, optimal combination of drugs to provide the best safety and efficacy profile. We also believe that the drugs that we choose to combine the tryptamines with work downstream from the 2A receptor, which makes us believe that we would block the antidepressant effect without compromising the antidepressant effect. The hallucinogenic effects without compromising the antidepressant effect. So it would still be a therapeutic drug. The other thing that, we're sort of looking at is when we choose the drugs to combine with is that the two drugs can be pro-cognitive. So kind of adding the two together would actually be more therapeutic than the two separately. So unfortunately not at liberty to say much more. But I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that's great. So at this point, I'd like to just first open it up to the panel for some broader discussion, if you'd like to revisit some of the issues we've talked about, and then in a few minutes, we'll open it up to the audience for general discussion. So, Mike?
Yeah, the discussion around plastogens is interesting. It's kind of making me think back to the question that you asked around the importance of the cognitive part of the therapy. Because if we kind of think about the mental model we use to understand for SSRIs and the sort of just needing to upregulate the amount of chemical, that's very different than saying we want to create new connections in brain and retrain the way the brain is wired. And so this class of compounds is really aimed toward that second model where we give something that unlocks the ability to form new connections or to strengthen connections that are important. But the process that our brain uses to do that is experience, right? It's the experiences of interacting with people and living, which suggests that the therapeutic part of it, not the pharmacology, but the therapy part of it may be really critical. And so I wonder how you're thinking about that, as you think about the introduction of plastogens that really are building on that framework.
I have no doubt that, we learned that from the SSRIs in depression. You can, as someone takes an SSRI, it'll help to a certain degree. If you just take psychotherapy, it'll help to a certain degree. But the real magic is combining them. And I think the same is going to be true for the plastogens, especially since you're making or repairing connections. The psychotherapy can fit right in there with learning, reinforcing certain ones and learning. I think it'll be an essential component of the with the medications, different from what with the psychedelics where you have to have the therapy before and during treatment and that time. We probably won't need that, but it'll be more run-of-the-mill psychotherapy, CBT, and it will help the compounds.
From a drug development standpoint, it makes it more complicated in the sense it's a complex intervention that has many degrees of freedom in the way that.
But a point I want to make when we're talking about this, can we take away the therapy? The effect sizes in these trials that have been out there thus far are huge. The effect size of Prozac in depression is 0.3, 0.4. The effect size in the psilocybin trials is like 1 or 1.
I've seen your data on OCD. It's incredible.
What that means is, yes, I'm sure the therapy is necessary. And in fact, from anecdotes from our own patients, I know patients who have therapy that feels more effective versus therapy where they didn't connect as well. That affects their experience, no question. But the new drugs, the drugs that work with less therapy, the application, they don't have to work as well as these first trials to be a huge breakthrough.
Oh, right.
If you get something that works 60% as well as the first trials,
that
would still be way better than Prozac and a huge breakthrough. And that's something it's important. I think we need, as we're testing new compounds, as we're testing new modes of administration that are, if you have something that's 10 times more efficient to administer and only 70% is effective, that's a huge win. And it's going to be easy to lose sight of that if we think of these as head-to-head comparisons without taking how that converts into value and into dissemination into account.
Yep.
One other topic that we haven't talked about is it's been very difficult, even though I'm a huge believer, I think this is going to work and the numbers are compelling. It's been very hard to have double-blind studies. And so this is something we all have to acknowledge in the industry that it's everything else. If I give you a breast cancer drug and a placebo, you have no idea what you're taking. If you take LSD and I give you a placebo, you know what you're taking. And so that is a challenge. And actually, one of the signs of that is, one of the studies that did not have good results recently is microdosing. So there's 100 tech execs out there who will tell you that they microdosed and it makes them feel much better and it's all great and creative and all that stuff. But the definition of microdosing is that you really shouldn't be able to feel it physically. And so here you did a study, you've taken out the placebo effect because you can't feel it, and actually the results were about the same. And so I'm very hopeful that's not the case for what I call macrodosing, which is not an actual word, but I do think it's going to work, but it is a challenge, and I don't think anyone has been able to overcome that issue so far.
Yeah. Well, with our compounds.
With yours, absolutely. No, this is for psychedelics with the psychedelic effect. Yeah. And yours absolutely would overcome that.
Yeah, but I think that there's an opportunity to be able to get a broader estimate if you compare against other active compounds. And so in the development of esketamine, for example, ketamine was compared to a drug called midazolam, which is a very effective Valium-like benzodiazepine medication that makes you feel a little woozy. And it's not a inactive drug, so people get somewhat better on midazolam. And so the magnitude of the benefit when you compare ketamine to, say, midazolam is smaller than the magnitude that you measure when you compare ketamine to an inactive placebo. But this gives you, in other ways, a fairer estimate of what the real unique value of the drugs is. And this has been absent. Sometimes it's helpful, not so much for determining whether or not there's efficacy, but for determining the unique part of the efficacy. So, for example, a comparison of MDMA to something like methylphenidate, which is a stimulant but doesn't block the serotonin transport, doesn't activate serotonin release. That would at least help us to understand what the unique benefit of the serotonergic part of MDMA is relative to just something that activates you. And there are other kinds of studies that could be done to, if not preserve the blind, contextualize the effects. And maybe that's a direction this work will need to go to truly understand the beneficial effects.
Can I bring up one other challenge, which is that the cost of doing all this, we obviously we don't want anything to be out in the market that's not safe. But on the other hand, the cost of doing these trials is so high that in the audience you might be saying, well, why don't you just try, MDMA versus 5 other things? But it takes $150 million to take one of these compounds through the process to approval. And that's just one. That's not to do comparisons. some of these are Schedule 1 drugs. And I think, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but the psilocybin that you have in the lab has to be kept in a 300-pound safe.
Yep.
So you have to have
you can bolt the safe to the floor. Yeah. It doesn't have to be.
Okay. Yeah. So, but it's treated like uranium. And I don't want uranium to be floating around, but to treat, psychedelic mushrooms that way, that I can either grow in my backyard tomorrow morning or call someone who will deliver it to this auditorium in about 30 minutes. It's just not, that's a little bit of an unfair comparison there, but yet the cost is staggering and it's setting everything back. And in all of our public policy, we need to think about what's the cost of getting something out there? What's the cost of not getting something out there? Do we just have another 25,000 people commit suicide because we don't have products for them? And so that's something we need to balance.
Well, this is this whole idea of interventional psychiatry. Psychiatry used to have, has still traditionally 3 pieces of equipment: 2 comfy chairs and a pad of paper to take notes. And now we realize that if the goal is to get people better, not just deliver treatment, that we have to go down new paths to get that. I think it's about time to open this discussion to the audience. I hope you will participate. We have microphones. 2 microphones over there, and people with their hands raised over here. Let's open it up for discussion.
You mentioned an experience of oceanic bliss or a boundless state. And Chris, you also mentioned meaning as a possible predictor of some of the underlying mechanics of how these compounds work. I'm curious if any of you are exploring possible correlations with mindfulness experiences, ancient traditions of Vedic philosophy, for example, that might help to explain what actually is going on in someone's personal experience, if consciousness is a part of the conversation, if spiritual awareness or a spiritual experience or meaning is a part of the conversation. I'd love to hear how you guys are thinking about that.
Sure. Yeah, it's really an important question, and I put those terms in my description of the possible mechanisms on purpose because I think it is really important. We have tools to develop drugs and make changes that you can see under a microscope, and that's a rational place to focus for new drug development. We shouldn't be blinded to the possibility that that's not a sufficient explanation for how these drugs work. And the best explanations, the most parsimonious explanations, might be on a different level of concepts in psychology and, yes, even spirituality. And I don't mean spirituality in a religious sense, but in terms of an experiential sense, the experience of having a spiritual, meaningful experience. Those things are an incredibly important part of what it is to be human. And it may well be that that's the best way to understand these. Now, in terms of how we think about developing treatment and how we think about developing novel drugs, I don't think that that's a useful framework to develop novel drugs. But I think it's an extremely useful framework to think about how they might be working and what may matter. So I'm glad you brought those things up. In terms of the connection to other schools of thought or other ways of understanding, there are many traditions, both the psychodynamic tradition within Western medicine, but also, as you pointed out, Vedic traditions and other traditions from various cultures that have tried to understand the less rational, somewhat more inchoate aspects of subjectivity and consciousness. I do think that it's really valuable to tap into all of those languages to try to understand what we're doing. And scientific-minded psychiatry is sometimes a little bit reluctant to do so, and I think that that's a shame, because they give us descriptive languages for phenomenology. So, and then more specifically, you talked about mindfulness, which is something that came from other, non-Western traditions and has been imported wholesale, which is all to the good, into mainstream psychiatric practice. I do think that of the aspects of current psychiatry that dovetail best with the psychological mechanisms of change that are happening with the psychedelics, I think that's some of the most fertile ground, as opposed to cognitive behavioral therapy or other aspects. I think that a mindful perspective, by which I mean pulling away from the humdrum of the everyday or the rigid patterns within which we live our lives and having a more reflective or removed internal perspective, that's closest to what seems to be going on psychologically with people who are benefiting from these drugs. I'm not sure it's the same thing, but I think it's a valuable perspective, and I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, just want to add something there that, for better or worse, the focus you hear today and the industry is focusing on these very difficult, psychiatric conditions and trying to help them. And that's obviously the highest priority. But for those of you out there, the vast majority of people who historically have been taking either recreationally or on their own psychedelics are not for the conditions we're talking about, but just because they want to deal with the fact that they need a better relationship with their father, or they've had trouble making commitments at work, or things like that aren't really psychiatric conditions, but just making them better off. And so the vast majority of people are benefiting enormously there. We're not talking about that. That's going to still remain, not in the legal framework, but incredibly positive, and millions of people already are benefiting from that. As the person who's probably done psychedelics more than most people on this panel, it's an amazing thing that just makes your life that was a 9 out of 10, a 9.5 out of 10, which is not what we've been talking about industry-wise. And I think taps into many of those things, and it's so hard to measure. If you go do ayahuasca in the jungle, it's a completely different tradition, and it's remarkable, and most people come back feeling like their life is better off, but not for all the reasons we talked about here.
Really interesting panel. And I have to say, some years ago, there was a chair of psychiatry at a major university that said to me, there's no such thing as outcomes research in psychiatry. And if that's the case, at least then, maybe it's different now, how are you going to capture some of the longer term outcomes, particularly from the standpoint of this category of drug, which is really complicated, and in the real world, not with highly protocolized type of therapeutics, coupled with, that is like the psychotherapy coupled with your therapeutics. How can you capture those data and then ultimately convince payers that they should pay for it?
Who would like to wrestle that?
The payers are already responding favorably to the use of ketamine. It's taken a while, as John knows, but they're seeing the burden of the dearth of effective treatments now, and they're seeing the benefit that people are receiving, and the tracking long-term outcomes in some ways is no different than with any of the conventional therapies. And we know that there's a high relapse rate with any of the conventional therapies. Over time, we'll learn more, through post-marketing surveillance and other approaches. We'll learn more about relapse rates with things like ketamine treatment. But the payers are figuring it out. It's still being done in most markets by way of carve-outs or some sorts of special contracts. There are now temporary codes in the CPT book for billing for these kinds of services. They'll likely become permanent once they kind of go through the trial period. A lot of mental health is carved out separately within the payer community already, and there are companies that are purpose-built to partner with the traditional insurance companies to deliver mental health services, and over time are able to track the efficacy of the networks that they're tying their patients to and the therapies that they're receiving. So it will be different than what we're currently doing, but it's a tractable problem.
Mm-hmm. So I think the payer question is actually kind of simple. You just have to convince them that they save money by treating these patients in the long term. So depressed patients are some of the most expensive patients, and to the insurance group, they see the doctor all the time for all different kinds of things. And then if you can convince them that you treat them with this, you'll save money in the long run.
Yeah. And the other part is the post-marketing research. So Johnson & Johnson, I think the only example that we have of this is with S-ketamine. So Johnson & Johnson recently released long-term data, average duration of treatment of 42 months with S-ketamine compared to historical controls. And the data were amazing, really. So a 10-fold reduction in the rate of suicide attempts, a greater than 5-fold reduction in death by suicide, and a greater than 3-fold reduction in all-cause mortality compared to standard antidepressant treatments, which already have effects on all those outcomes. So I think what we're going to see is a qualitatively different outcomes from long-term treatment with these interventions that I think will be, the companies will need to be held responsible for making sure they collect these kind of long-term data, but it's in everybody's interest that this data be collected.
For the insurance companies and ultimately the employers that are paying the bills for the insurance, the payback is not necessarily just in the reduction in the expenditures on mental health. It's the reduction in the expenditures on more traditional medical care, because the overlay of mental illness on chronic disease doubles or triples the cost of caring for patients with those chronic diseases. And the cost of that care is, in dollar terms, much more significant in many cases than the cost of the psychiatric, the mental health care itself.
Right. That's what I was saying. For depressed patients, sees a physician for lots of different reasons. Oh, pain, can't sleep. But they're very, very expensive. For their total cost is very high, not just related to the depression, but to everything else.
Right. Well, even the presence of a comorbid psychiatric disorder worsens all of your medical outcomes, increases all of your medical costs. So, for example, if you have cardiovascular disease and you're depressed, your mortality doubles.
In the phase 3 trials for MDMA, I think the average patient in there had PTSD for 11 or 12 years, order of magnitude. And after 6 months, 66% of the patients were pronounced to have no PTSD. So if you're an insurance company, that is a drop the mic, let's go home moment, and you want to pay for that all day long.
Hi. Earlier in my career, I was at FDA, so I worry about FDA. I'm at EIR now. But I lived through the SSRI concerns back in the 2000s and, the development of the Columbia scale. And some of those same medical officers are still at FDA, but are now in these safety positions. So since I left FDA, there's been an evolution in the Center for Drugs of having these specialized areas. So it might not be the review division. You may go and have a meeting and have a wonderful meeting with the review division, but then later on you hear from the study endpoint team about your PRO. You hear about the, needing to do the CCASA Columbia scale for suicidality. You hear about the drug abuse, the drug liability studies. When I was hearing about the combination, you could have, 1,000 years, patient years data in a substance, but when you put the two together, the toxicology group will want to see animal studies with both of those in the animals. They'll want to see a full factorial. If you have component A and component B, they're going to want the placebo, the mono and the mono, and then the dual. So they're going to throw everything at you. The senior management will say, we're collaborative, we're here to help, but the reviewers will have a bias and they will throw all their tools at you. So when you do go for a meeting, not only ask for the review division, but say all of the other ancillary groups and try to list them specifically, because the sooner you get that feedback from them, the sooner you can prepare for those companies who are afraid to hear the bad news. They then unfortunately get surprised late. And the one example I'll raise is Acomplia, Rimonabon, who was a CB1 partial agonist that ended up going to advisory committee 0 to 13. And that was based, so several thousand patients in the clinical trials. It was a suicidality, not suicide, but suicidality risk. 6 patients in the study group, 3 patients in the placebo. So relative risk of 2. And, ultimately there was a suicide. But the bottom line is that it was just that small number that could tip the scale. So you've got your work cut out for you. There's great potential. It certainly is going to be worth it. But being prepared for FDA's sort of curveballs are going to be discouraging.
Well, those are very wise words of advice, and we appreciate having them. Those will be the last words of our session. I want to thank our panel members for a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much for coming. This is really a fascinating topic and discussion.